Hi and welcome to the first video of this tutorial series. We're going to kick this tutorial series off by talking about scope. And scope is basically where a variable is accessible, or to be more accurate, where if the value of a certain variable is accessible. So if we have a global variable, it's going to be in the global scope because the value for that variable is accessible within that scope. In this video, I would like to talk about three scopes. We are going to talk about the global scope, the function scope, and we're going to also talk about the block scope. And in each of these, we are going to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to talk about let, const, and var. First, global scope. Global scope is the scope of the current JavaScript file. So this 2-scope.js, it has a main scope. That is the global scope. Any variable that I specify or declare within the scope will be accessible within the entire global scope, within all of its functions and all of its blocks. What I would like to do is I would like to use let for this example, and I'm going to say let username is equal to Pythonista64. Let's say this is the username, and I'm going to console log it. We're going to use console log, the console section of the web page, the browser, to actually test our code. And you can access this. I'm sure you do have some previous knowledge of JavaScript. And if you're directly coming from my JavaScript crash course for beginners, you're just going to feel right at home. And in case you're not familiar, with the basics of JavaScript, this series is not for you, because I don't talk about the beginning and fundamentals of JavaScript. I don't even talk about the intermediate. This is like more modern, more advanced JavaScript, and you're going to basically be lost. So if you just right click, go to inspect, and from there go to console, you can find this tab. And I'm going to say console log username, and you can see that we have access to it. It says Pythonista 64. Now, this variable can also be accessed within a function, so within a block other than the block of this entire global scope. And I'm going to call this print name function. And what it is going to do is it's basically going to print the value of this variable from the function. So I'm going to say console.log, and I'm going to specify function echo. And then let's grab the username. And now I need to invoke the function print name. Let's call it, and you can see that it says function echo Pythonista64. I'm going to add a colon here. So anything that is declared that can be that is declared within the global scope, it can be accessed within the entire global scope. This is a global scope. I should provide a comment here. And I'm going to say global. Come on, buddy. This is the first video. I should not mess up in this one. And the next scope that I would like to talk about is the function scope. So now that you know what global scope is, you can understand what a function scope is. A function scope is the kind of scope in which the variables that are specified within the function, they can only be accessed, or their values can only be accessed within that scope. That's why it's called function scope, because it is that local scope of a function that we're talking about. I'm going to create a function. These are basically function declarations. I'm going to say user details, and we're going to take a look at that. So within the user details, we are going to have let username. I'm going to set it to Pythonista64, and I'm going to add a password here. Okay, so this is a password, and I'm going to add basically like a bunch of like that. These are the kind of passwords that I create all the time. And I'm going to say console.log. Let's use backticks. The username is, let's grab the value of, it has to be $. Let's grab the value of username. The username is this, and the password, and the password is Let's grab the value of password. And let's save that. We don't see anything because we need to invoke the function user details. Let's invoke the function. Let's save that. There we go. So we know what the username is. We know what the password is. I could surround it by a pair of double quotes. And now it's a little bit better readable. Now the thing here is that this username and this password, they cannot be accessed outside of the function. Now there is something that I actually missed. I told you that I'm going to talk about in the context of let, const, and then var. So I'm just going to comment these ones back in. We can see that we have a variable that has been declared with let. I'm going to copy paste that one below, and I'm going to declare this with const. And it's going to be the same thing. Let and const, aside from the fact that you cannot redeclare a const variable, they're going to behave in the same way. And for this particular example, var is going to behave in the same manner as well. It can be accessed within the scope of a function. Var. Let's save that. There we go. It can be accessed. So all three of them behave in the same way. Let, const, and var in the global scope. But what about function scope? In the scope of a function, they're going to behave in the same way as well, because vars, they're actually function scoped. And let and const, they're block scope. Now I'm going to change this let to const for the password so we stay diverse. Now these values, we know very well that they're accessible within this function. Let's create another variable, I don't know, like offline, and I'm going to set it to false, like a Boolean. False. And I could use that. You know what? I'm not going to use it within here. It's not going to make any sense. Now, these values, they can be accessed within the function. But a function scope is the kind of scope outside of which you cannot access those values. So if I were to say console, if I just go ahead and copy this console log and grab it and put it outside the function and save it, you can see that from line 23, it says reference error. And this error is basically when the JavaScript engine cannot reference the value of a variable. That's why it says reference error. So you need to understand, you need to pay very close attention to what kind of error you're getting, because based on that error, you can debug your application or your code. Username is not defined. Username is not defined here. The takeaway of a function scope is that when a variable is declared within a function scope, it doesn't matter if it is let, const, or var. I could just add var here like casually. And the user is, let's just grab the value of offline, and it's still going to give me that. But if I add this, let's copy it all the way to there. Let's put it there, save it. And the user is, where is the rest of it? And the user password, and the user is false. Like the user is not online, it's offline. But you get the idea. The idea is that it doesn't matter if it is let, const, or var. You cannot access those variables outside of a function. I'm going to comment everything out. Now, so far, everything is like rudimentary. It's pretty much boring. But when we talk about block scope, this is where things get interesting. Why? Because this is where let, const, and var, they behave in different ways. Now, var, keep in mind, you have to keep this in mind. One of the reasons that we don't use var anymore in modern JavaScript is because var, in fact, is function scope. Other than a function being defined in a function, var doesn't have a scope. What do I mean by that? Let us create a for loop, a very regular one. I'm going to say for var, I is going to start from 0. And then let's say I goes all the way to less than, I don't know, like let's say 4. So 3 iterations. And I'm going to increment I after each iteration. Now, we know that we have access to the I variable from within this for loop. I'm going to say inside for loop, we do have access to the value of I. And I'm going to pass that in. I could use template literals. And there we go. And I'm going to grab the value of I and I'm going to put it right here. And you can see that it says inside for loop 0, 1, 2, 3 because it starts from 0. If I change it to 1, it's going to be 1, 2, 3. Now, the issue with variables declared with var is that they're not going to have any other scope other than a function scope. Now, this is a for loop. We know that this is not a function. So if I were to say console log outside for loop, I can still access the value for it. The value of I can still access it outside of the for loop. Now, there is something that might spook you at first. Why is outside for loop? It says 4. Why is it not like 1, 2, 3? Because the first reason is that we're outside of the loop. When something is outside the loop, it's not going to iterate. And secondly, we have already iterated through all of the iterations of the loop. So the loop started at 1 and it checked for the condition. The condition says as long as I is less than 4. When I starts with 1, 1 is less than 4, and then we pass it right here. After this block of code runs, we grab the I and we increment it by 1. So 1 plus 1, 2. 2 against the condition is going to hold true. And then we pass it again within this block of code and we print it. So now I is 2. When we say I is 2, we increment it by 1. I is going to become 3. And then we evaluate it against this condition again. So as many times as the loop runs, in every iteration, the loop's variable must be evaluated against the loop condition. If it satisfies that condition, then the loop is going to run. Otherwise, it's going to stop. Now, I is 3. 3 is less than 4. We are going to run this console log again. That's how we get 3. But watch what happens when I increment I by 1 more. So it was 3, now it is 4. When I evaluate it against this condition, it's no longer true. Even though the current value of I is 4, we're not seeing it printed on the console because the condition was not satisfied. The condition says less than 4, and I is 4. And that is exactly why when I say outside the for loop, it grabs the current value of I. And the current value of I is 4. It's not 1, it's not 2, it's not 3, it's 4. Because it is calculating it, it's grabbing the value after the for loop has run. After the for loop is completed, the value of I becomes 4. So it was a little bit of a side note. Now that's what happens when you declare a for loop with a var. But what about let and const? Const is not going to work here, and I'm going to show that to you as well. And when I save it, you can see that it says right on line 40, it says reference error. Again, the same kind of error. I is not defined. Why? Because let and const, they're actually block scoped. They're not global scoped. They're not function scoped. They're block scoped. And what is a block in JavaScript? It is a pair of curly braces, aka curly brackets. Whenever you see a pair of curly braces or brackets, that is a block. And if you declare a variable with a with a let or const, these two keywords, they make this block, they make it a scope. Why? Because let and const can only be accessed within that scope. And isn't that the definition of a scope? It is something, it is where, it's a place where a variable can be accessed. Then it is a scope. Otherwise, it's not a scope. And now that's why for loop is not gonna, you're not gonna be able to access the value of I outside the loop. And for const, it's not gonna work either. Why? Because the value of const I starts from 1. And then we increment it to 2, and that is not allowed in const because it's a constant variable. Now let's talk a little bit more about this block scope. And to be able to give you a little bit more examples, I'm going to just separate our example here. I'm going to create a variable with let, and I'm going to say let first name is equal to Muslim, And I'm going to change, I will be able to change the first name, right? To whatever, to like, let's say John. And we don't see any errors. It means that this code actually run. What about const? Last name, and I'm going to set it to Hilali. And I could change it, right? Or so I can think. Is that the correct sentence? I'm not sure. Let's move on. So I'm going to say Oliver. And when I save that, you can see we have that type error. Now keep in mind, before we had a reference error, now this is a type error. It's not like something you have mistyped. It is something that what you've done is actually you have specified the value of the const. You cannot redefine a constant variable. All right? So this doesn't work. I'm going to comment this one out. We're going to come back to this const, and I'm going to create a variable with var. Let's set it to developer, and then I could technically change it, right? To painter. Let's save that. We don't see an error. It means that it worked. But what about if I just open a pair of curly braces? I told you that this is a block, this is a scope, this is a block, but it becomes a scope only if I use let or const. As long as you're using var, this is not a scope. And I can prove that to you. So I'm going to say var job. This is, let's say now the guy wants to become a like climber. When I save that, and I'm going to come down below and I'm going to say console.log. Let's grab the value of job. What do you think is going to be the value of job? Is it going to be developer, painter, or climber? It's going to be climber. Why? Because I declared this variable job in here. I initialized it to developer. And then I redeclared it. I reinitialized it to painter. And then within this block, I changed that value again to climber. I can do that. And that is actually one of the biggest issues with var. But what about this let and this const? Can we do the same thing with let and const? Let's take a look at that. So first name, let's say I want to change the first name to Mike. And when I save it, as soon as I type that, you can see that this first name, it seems to be faded out a little, like grayed out a little. Why? Because it has not been used anywhere. Now I'm going to say console.log first name. I'm not going to save that. And I'm going to console.log here as well. So we have one console log on line 57, another one on line 61. What do you think the console log on line 57 is going to print? What do you think the console log on 61 is going to print? The console log on 57 is going to print Mike. And the console log on line 61 is going to print Muslim. And when I save it, there we go. So on 57, Mike, sorry, I changed it to John. So it is basically John because I actually changed that value to John. There we go. So it is John. Now the same thing happens with a const variable as well. Now the reason that let did not overwrite the first name from John to Mike was this is a totally different variable. They do have the same name, but they are completely different variables. This is a different first name than this one. Why? Because these two are defined in separate scopes. This first name Mike, this has been defined in the scope of a block, but this first name John, it has been defined in the scope of global, or basically in the global scope. The same behavior, we are going to expect that from const as well. I could change this to, what should be Olsen? And I can say first name, let's change it to last name. And I'm going to copy paste that, put it right here. So what do you think? Is the last name going to be on line 50? What's going to be the last name on line 59? And what's going to be the last name on line 64? On line 59, it's going to be Olsen. But on line 64, because it's in the global scope, it's going to be Halali. Let's save that. And so line 59, here it is Olsen. And then 64, we have this already. Now you know why we prefer using let and const over var. And you know what are some of these shortcomings that you need to expect when working with var. Now there is also another issue, and you thought, okay, that was it. There is actually another issue. I'm going to comment everything out. Now another big issue with var is that variables created with var can have duplicate names in the same scope. Okay, and we already saw an example of that because var is not block scoped. So technically this one, I'm going to comment these ones in so you can see the coloring. So technically this var and this var, they are both of them in the same scope. They are in the global scope. It's like this. It's as if I were to declare a variable, initialize it to developer, change its value to painter, and then reinitialize or redeclare it and change it to climber. It is completely fine with var, but it is not fine with let and const. And I'm going to show you an example of that as well and why that could be a big issue. What I would like to do is I would like to create an employee status. Let's say you have an employee whose status you are interested in. And let's say it is a new employee and you want to know whether or not you have hired that. Now it says hired, it means you have hired that employee. And I'm going to say console.log employee status, and we can see it says hired. Now I've already created this variable. I've declared it and it is employee status. Technically I should not be able to create another one, but unfortunately that is not true with var. So in this one you can see that I'm redeclaring this variable and I'm going to change it to, okay, I'm mad with this employee and I want him fired. And now you can see it says fired. There are no errors here. But this you cannot do with let and const. And we are going to take a look at an example of that. For that, I'm going to comment these ones out. And I'm going to change these two to let. And already you can see there is an error. And what is it saying? Syntax error. Keep in mind the different types of error. Identifier employee status has already been declared. So the identifier for this variable, which is this employee status, it has already been declared. And where is this coming from? It's coming from line 76 because that's where we try to redeclare it. It's already been declared. It cannot happen with let, and we know because const cannot have different values for the same variable, it definitely cannot work for const either. And again, identifier employee status has already been declared at line number 82. Where is it? Okay, declared at here. Line number 79. There we go. So now you know the difference between let, var, and let, const, and var. And you know where you can use each of them and why you should prefer using let and const over var. Now, you might have this question, okay, where should I use let? So I'm not going to use var, okay, that's cool. But where should I use let and where should I use const? If you are declaring variables in the global scope, it's like you're selecting DOM elements or HTML elements. It is usually a better idea to use const. Because when you grab an HTML element, let's say it is an anchor element, you're not going to change that, right? It's going to be that anchor element. So it's a good idea to have that type check at the start of the file so you know you don't redeclare it again. You're not going to have to redeclare it. That's I think a good idea. But for variables that you think might end up being redeclared in the future, then you're going to use let. And then there is another approach. The other approach is that you're going to use let everywhere, and after your application is done and you're in the refactoring phase, you're going to check whether or not a variable has changed its value. If it has changed its value, then you're going to leave it as a let. But if it stays the same, you're going to change that let to const. So that is another approach as well. Basically, I don't do the second one. Mine is the first one. And it's like more of, I just think on the spot whether or not I'm going to change it. But for the global variables, what I would like to do is mostly I'm not saying that I do it all the time, but I try to use const, and I try to not think of these trivial things that much because they're going to hinder your process of learning programming. These are very small things. You need to get past them as soon as possible, not get hung up on them, and you can move on and you can advance, learn the advanced stuff, the stuff that really matter. That's going to be it for this video. See you in the next one.